Without objection. The senator from Minnesota.
Mr. President, I ask the pending amendment be set aside so that it may offer an amendment.
Is there objection?
Objection.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President, I'm disappointed that an objection has been raised. I intended to offer Amendment 2189. It's at the desk. It's the Coleman-DeMint-Thune-Inhofe Amendment, which would prohibit the FCC from reinstating the Fairness Doctrine. Let me just tell a little bit of what we intend to do. I'm not asking for a vote here. I'm not asking for any kind of limitations in time. I want an amendment to be put in the queue. It's an amendment, by the way, which the House, it's an issue with the House dealt with, and in the House, this bill passed. I think over 300 votes in favor, 113 Democrats supported the crux of the amendment, which I intended to offer. It passed, I think, 309 to 115. The amendment would have said that the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, would not be able to reinstate the Fairness Doctrine. And it says, and I'll read, the Commission shall not have the authority to prescribe any rule, regulation, policy, doctrine, or other requirement that has the purpose or effect of reinstating or promulgating in whole or part the requirement that broadcasters, including the Armed Forces Network, present opposing viewpoints and controversial issues of public importance, commonly referred to as the Fairness Doctrine. First, Mr. President, there is nothing fair about the Fairness Doctrine. In the past few weeks, there has been discussion among some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle who have said very publicly, it's time to reinstate the Fairness Doctrine. We have troops in the field of combat today who are putting their lives on the line. And part of what we protect in this country, the first of all amendments, the First Amendment, it's freedom of speech. The Fairness Amendment is a relic of a bygone past. It was tossed on the ash heap of history about 1987. It was in place from 49 to 87. Its intended effect was to have the federal government monitor what's said on the airwaves and then require broadcasters to present what the federal government calls balance. The effect was much different than that. Much different than that. In effect, it stifled speech. If you're a broadcaster, you own a station, and you're subject to fine, some kind of penalty, if you don't provide the kind of balance that the government says you must provide, then you run the risk of some kind of penalty. You may well choose, and in fact history showed what happened, you may well choose simply to play country music. And I love country music, but I also love free speech. And we don't want to put in place anything that stifles free speech. We've moved from 1949, when you had a few TV stations and the information that you got came from a relatively few sources, to a world today in which we have broadband and high-speed internet and satellites and blogs and a whole range of information. And that's a good thing. That's a good thing. In the end, we in this body have to respond, have to listen to the voices of the people, and we want an informed and educated citizenship, and we want them to get diverse views. And the reality, Mr. President, in part why this issue even comes up, because of concerns of my friends on the other side of the aisle, that talk radio somehow is dominated by conservatives. One may argue that perhaps broadcast journalism may be dominated by liberals. There have been studies that have shown that. But for us, we shouldn't care in terms of whether it's dominated by, and have the response of the government come in and try to somehow measure or regulate.
Would the Senator yield for a question?
Senator, I will yield.
I would ask the Senator if he believes in the interest of an educated electorate, whether he thinks Americans should hear both sides of the story, a kind of fair and balanced approach when it comes to information.
Mr. President, I absolutely believe that Americans should hear both sides. Absolutely. But I believe, strongly believe, that the government should not be in the position of deciding and dictating, now here is the other side. We have in the world of communications today, Americans have all sorts of options to hear the side. All they got to do is turn a dial. All they got to do is push a button. All they got to do is press a mouse. And they have that ability.
Would the Senator yield for a further question?
Mr. President, I yield to a question.
Does the senator concede that the airwaves belong to the American people?
Mr. President, I concede the airways belong to the American people.
Would the senator yield for a further question?
Mr. President, I yield for a further question.
Would the senator concede that those who use the people's airwaves to make a profit have to do it with a license from our government?
Mr. President, I understand and agree that we have a licensing process.
Would the senator yield for further question?
Mr. President, I will yield, and I would yield for the senator from Illinois to present the entire question so that I can continue with maintaining the floor and discussing the amendment.
And I'm not trying to delay the senator from Minnesota. I will concede that since the Fairness Doctrine has been set aside under the Reagan administration, things have changed in broadcast journalism and many other aspects of journalism. But I just want to make sure that I haven't seen the senator's amendment. I know what it might be leading to, but I want to make sure that the premise is something that we may agree on. The airwaves belong to the American people. Those who profit from them do them by permission of the people through their government, and that those who use those airwaves should do it responsibly and should seek to provide both points of view, both sides of the story, so that Americans can reach a decision. I'd ask the senator from Minnesota if he disagrees with any of those things.
Here's what Mr. President, I would say to my learned colleague from Illinois. Here's our point of disagreement. There is no question, in fact, that there's a licensing process. I was a former mayor. We licensed a lot of things. But I think one of the basic principles that are at stake is that we don't license and measure content when it comes to speech. And that's my concern. That, in fact, because of the multiplicity of communications options that are available to citizens today, as I said before, blogs and internet and broadband and satellite, which we didn't have 20, 30 years ago. Where my objection lies, and the importance of this amendment, is to say government shouldn't be monitoring and regulating content. We're not talking about obscenity. There are things that the senator from Illinois understands that government has an absolute right to monitor or to deal with. But we're not talking about when we get to content. And that's my concern, that those who have raised the issue of bring back the Fairness Doctrine are bringing it back. And the cry then is to regulate content, and that's what I object to. And that's